Hello, I'm James Henry, and this is The Message.
The Message.
Good morning, I'm James Henry. I'm the pastor of St. James, and I'm going to be bringing the message this morning. And we are in the second week of what I want to call the Godly but Irreligious series. The series about what does it mean to really look like God wants us to look rather than looking religious. I think sometimes we get so caught up in looking religious. Checking off the boxes of going to church and being kind to that one neighbor once a week because it's in the requirements and then moving on. You know, those kinds of check boxes are not what God is really all about. God is bigger than the check boxes of our lives. So if God wants us to be something more than just religious, what does God want? Last week we found out, I told you to go out this week and be a divine irritant. I found that last week's piece about doing justice was deeply irritating to me. I found that it just pushed my buttons to want to not only, have a law and order stance, but to also have a deep concern for those who are broken and in need of God's love and justice and hope. Well, this second piece was like an ever unfolding piece, because if you were to read 4 different translations of this verse, to love mercy or love kindness or embrace loving kindness, or yet another one was to love loyalty. There are all these pieces because the word in Hebrew means so much more than just mercy. It's not just about being kind to one another. It's a whole bigger piece. One of my favorite Old Testament theologians tells me over and over again that this is the most common word used to refer to who God is. One of God's characteristics is this word. I'm not going to say it in Hebrew because it doesn't really matter. After today, you'll probably go out and forget it anyway, just like I did, until I read about it all week long, over and over and over again, this unfolding picture of who God is. If you're a psalm reader, and I know a lot of people who are not fond of psalms, if you're a psalm reader, there is this piece that keeps coming up over and over again, and depending on your translation, it's something similar, and the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever, or never ceases, or goes on and on and on. And that steadfast love, that tenacious fidelity, if you will, of God to us, and in our relationship, despite the fact we're not tenaciously, faithful to God, God is always tenaciously faithful to us. And over again, the Hebrew Bible tells us that's who God is. That's who God is. And God wants us to love that tenacious faithfulness, so much so that we live it out in our everyday lives. So what does this look like? Why did we even bring up this word? Why does it even matter? Why does this whole piece, James, why couldn't you have just preached the whole thing, whipped through those little 3 subordinate clauses and what God requires? Well, it seemed like to me, though, that if God required these 3 things, we ought to be sure we are doing them. It's not like a suggestion. Last week we found out justice wasn't a suggestion. Well, neither is loving mercy or embracing loving kindness or being loyal, having this tenacious faithfulness. So one of the key things for us to understand, when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it was very interesting to read all of these folks, all these different articles this week. And it kept getting bigger and bigger. I would read my Jewish sisters and brothers who have one take on this word and one understanding. And then I would read these Christian folks who would have a whole nother take on this piece. And they would want this to be, they would want to say that we never talk about the Old Testament. And the reason we don't talk about the Old Testament is because God is mean in the Old Testament. But if you've ever really read it, don't ever let somebody caricature a book for you. Don't ever let somebody caricature an entire connection, especially when it's more than half the Bible. Because that's what we've done. We've caricatured it into mean God, happy, loving God, as if the Old Testament is all about the mean piece and the New Testament is all about the... But over and over again, our Hebrew sisters and brothers, Jewish sisters and brothers, affirm more than 245 times in the Old Testament, God's steadfast love, His tenacious fidelity is reaffirmed over and over again. If God is tenaciously faithful to us and tells us that we need to be tenaciously faithful not only to God, but to one another, ought we not to think that that's something to take seriously, that it's something we ought to do with our lives? So what does it look like? First of all, it looks concrete. You all have these ideas, and I say you all because it's really me. I have these wonderful, warm, fuzzy feelings about what loving faithfulness ought to look like. But it's a concrete reality. It's meant to be a touch point in our lives. I can point to some times in my life, real times, when I absolutely know God was tenaciously faithful to me. He carried me through my teenage years. Anybody here have those awkward teenage years? Or did you all come through those like totally smoothly? I need to talk to you about how that worked out. But for me, my teenage years kind of stank. You know, they were, trying to figure out who I was. I was very geeky, outside the cool set. And, my parents weren't wealthy enough for us to have, we were lower middle class and we were good, and my parents are wonderful people. But, until the 7th grade, I never had a pair of Levi's. And that was what everybody wore. I wore Wranglers. They're popular again, but not when I was growing up, baby. If you were wearing Wranglers, that meant that you were from, you're a little slightly poorer than everybody else. You couldn't be quite as cool as everybody else. I look back on those years as dark, painful, alienating kinds of years. I rose to popularity purely because I became, I entered, drama. I did the drama thing. And every year when, in my 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade years when I was in the play, I became popular for this brief period of time. And I look back on it and I think, really? It was that brief period of time? But it was sort of, and I sought after that, but it was an awkward, painful time. You're trying to figure out who you are when you're a teenager. All your hormones are starting to rush around in your body and trying to figure out what that means and how you're supposed to live it out. Do you know what? God was really faithful to me in those years. God never abandoned me. And believe me, there were some moments that I was probably worthy of abandonment. But God was tenaciously faithful and carried me through. I'm amazed I survived my teenage years. Let alone my 20s were just crazy. They were absolutely insane. I wanted to see how fast, my Nissan Sentra, 5-speed Nissan Sentra would go on the highway. I can remember once going down a mountain, cresting over 100 miles an hour, thinking, no, this is the edge. I was channeling all the pain and angst of my teenage years into my 20s. It's really good for you probably that you didn't know me in my 20s. I was not a nice guy in my 20s. I was kind of mean and ugly because I was channeling the pain and the lack of mercy in my own life that I did not realize had been there all along. Do you know when you finally discover how merciful God is and how forgiving God is, and you finally let that mercy flow into you, when you finally realize, I've discovered it over and over again in my life. But last year, after I turned 52, did I turn 52 this year? It was the year before that I turned 51. Yeah, I'm an old dude. Okay, I'm an old dude. Last year when I turned 51 and I was starting to seriously pray, and I started to really realize that I had never been merciful with myself. I love to be merciful with other people, but I wasn't really merciful with them. Have you ever been sort of merciful with other people? I was having this great conversation. Mom always just sends me onto a whole new plane. When we had a conversation yesterday, she was telling me about what she's teaching in Sunday school this morning. She teaches adult Sunday school for people who are generally all older than she is, and she's 80. So she was telling me all these new things she's discovering, and she was talking about mercy and how does that look and how do we live out forgiveness and salvation and all those kinds of things. And what was intriguing to me as we were having this conversation is I was saying things to her and she was bouncing them back to me. But, we talk about mercy, and she said, well, I always find it's much easier to be merciful with other people than it is with myself. But the truth is, I said, but Mom, think about it. I'll be honest with you. I seem to have a lot of mercy in that outgoing kind of way. But I'm merciful with you and cut you slack. And then on the inside, I'm thinking, what a slacker. What a crackhead. I'm thinking all of these other things on the outside. I can make it sound like, oh, I'm completely accepting of the fact that you didn't do what you promised you'd do, or you didn't do this other thing, or you didn't show up and fix the thing you promised me. I mean, I can act on the outside like I'm totally merciful about the thing, totally. And on the inside, not at all, not feeling merciful until recently. In the last year, when I learned to be merciful with myself and to accept God's mercy. When I finally realized that God meant the mercy for me and that God was serious. So those broken teenage years when I said merciless things to people, when I wasn't as kind, I was outwardly kind. I was all about appearances. But on the inward, inside I was kind of mean. Channeling pain and angst of being a teenager and other things. And in my 20s, I was definitely not someone you would ever want your daughter to date. Just no, lock her up. It's amazing. At the end of my 20s, Linda dated me and then married me, and then I'm very fortunate. Very, very, very fortunate. But the truth is, there was a darkness, and most of it was I had never been merciful with myself, so I channeled some of the meanness. If you ever get on my bad side, and I don't suspect any of you ever will, but if you ever get close to me and then get on my bad side, you want to feel pain. I can whip some ugly words right out that will rip your heart to the core. And I'm not proud of that. I'm just telling you. That's how I learned to deal with the world in kind of a sarcastic, snarky way. I don't seem all that way on Sunday morning, do I? No, James, sarcastic? No. Well, be thankful. Be thankful, because that would I wouldn't last very long in United Methodist Church if I was snarky and sarcastic all the time. You know why? Because God was tenaciously merciful and faithful to me and never gave up. Never give up, never surrender. That's God. God chases us tenaciously for a whole lifetime so that we can learn what mercy looks like, and then we can channel it to somebody else. Now, if I'm merciful with you, it's usually because I'm pretty merciful. And what I found out when I talked about this being concrete, being real, I could point to those moments in my life when I felt God's presence, but I didn't know what that was because I didn't know what mercy was. Now that I've finally discovered, I hope it won't take 5 decades for most of you to discover what mercy is, but when I finally discovered it, I realized that was the feeling I was having in my teens, in the most dark times of my life, when I felt the mercy. In the 20s, when I was channeling my pain through meanness and pretty facade, ugly inside, when I began to realize that those feelings I had, those moments when I was overwhelmed by love, that was God's mercy in those moments. And finally, five decades into my life, I really begin to understand that mercy is born in relationship. I think one of the problems we have in the church is that we want to know about God. And what God wants us to do is know God. Take the preposition out of the middle of it. God doesn't want you to know about Him. I know plenty of people who know a ton about God. I knew if you'd ever wanted me to quote you a Bible verse in my teens and 20s, baby, I could lay it out for you. I knew the Bible backwards and forwards. I knew all the stories. I knew all the characters. I could tell you all I knew about God, but I didn't know that guy, gal, whoever. I didn't know God. I knew about God. I could talk about God to the end of the earth. But what God really wants us to do is know God, and that's what Hesed is about. Okay, I said I wasn't going to say it's really Hesed is the way it sounds, like you're clearing your throat. It's a very guttural sound. But Hesed is the kind of tenacious love that's born in relationship and a sense of connection. God wants you to know God, not know about God. God could care less how many verses you can quote from the Bible if you can still treat your neighbor poorly. And if you can still ignore God when God is crying out for your attention. If you can do that, you don't know God, you know about God. And that's the bottom line of what I see in this word, in this second clause of this story. What God requires, what God wants desperately from you is that kind of tenacious faithfulness that never gives up and never surrenders. Not only on God, but on each other. God wants us to love each other. But the kind of love that is merciful, that's characterized by mercy, true mercy, but also is accountable. You know what's funny to me is that there's two sides to this loving mercy, to this embracing loving kindness, to this loving loyalty. And that is, it's two-way. God has always been loyal to us, but so much wants us to be loyal to Him. And our relationships are about holding each other accountable as well as forgiving each other. So if you're really being merciful, I can remember when Linda was first working for Lorton Community Action Center. She came home one day because when she worked at Lorton Community Action Center the first time, she's the executive director now, but then she was the director of emergency services. People would come into her office and sit down when they were in, if you don't know what Linda, my wife, Linda, does, she essentially works for an organization that meets people's primary needs when they're struggling, whether it's food or sometimes rental assistance or utility assistance, and especially for children, but for adults and others. Some of our soldiers, more than 40 families, almost 50 families, from Fort Belvoir who are in that tight area of need. That's what she does. One of the things she came home and she told me that she did when people came in for assistance is she made them write out a budget. And I thought, boy, that was kind of mean. That's kind of mean, making them write out a budget. But she would tell me that, if I help you once, I can write you a $500 check, but if you keep squandering all the money that you take in, you're going to come back to me next month and want another $500 check. And then the month after that and want another $500 check and another one. She told me a story. It was a generic story about a person who was having trouble paying for food, but they had just bought a car that they were paying $500 or $600 a month on payments on. And that's why they couldn't afford their rent, that's why they couldn't afford their utilities, and why they couldn't afford food. So she said, look, we got to look at this, look at the income that you have and look at the outgo. And the biggest chunk of your outgo right now that is already spoken for is this car. You just need it to be repossessed. You need to take it back to them and say, take this out of my hands. Because if you want the mercy that I have to offer, you also need to be accountable. You have to know that mercy is in part that kind of gentle giving, but it's also that holding accountable. When we don't quite stretch, when we don't quite make that bridge, when we don't. Somebody, to truly be merciful, when I mess up a sermon, the most merciful thing you can do is not walk by and say on Sunday morning, great sermon, James. Because if it's a lie, I don't need to hear that. Now, on the other side of it, I'm not really interested in you ignoring me either. As I come towards you, it's like, oh no, I don't want to tell him. It stunk. So you run around. I don't need you to do that either. True hesed, true love, true fidelity would say, James, you know what? You've done better. Here's where I went astray. Here's where I thought you went astray. There's kind of an accountability, an expectation, a gentleness. That's what I see in this word. Is born out of relationship, a kind of ethic that wants to be in relationship and tenaciously holds on, is faithful. Is faithful. God is always faithful to us. If I were going to challenge us, I think this text requiring us to love mercy is challenge perhaps enough, but what are some practical ways that maybe, last week it was be a divine irritant in the world seeking justice. This week is be honest with yourself and maybe be honest with one other person. Find somebody that you love, you care about, you're connected to, and look for the touch point moments in your life when you have experienced concretely in reality the mercy of God. Not esoterically, not in an imagined way, but when have you really experienced mercy and knew that it was God? Because if you can have those touch points, then you'll have what the Hebrew people had in what we would call the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. Over and over again, when they went into exile, when their lives fell apart, when they were conquered by others, then they didn't live in exile, but when they lived oppressed. Over and over again, you know what they kept talking about when they talked about God? They didn't say God is a meanie, God is messed up, God hates our guts. They kept describing God, that God's steadfast love endures forever. Do you have any of those moments, those touch point concrete moments that when your life seems to be coming unglued that you can point to? I used to point to my 20s alone. This week as I sat down and reflected, I realized it was in my teens. Those were some touch points, some real concrete moments when I experienced the real presence of God, the unrelenting love of God. I experienced it when both of my children were born. I experienced it when out of the blue, Hannah or Josh will say to me, "I love you, Dad," just out of the blue. I experienced it when my son thought of me when he was in high school, when he went on a trip to Germany, or Austria actually, as a part of his exchange program. And he brought me back what he thought would be most valuable to me. He brought me back a Bible. I saw it this morning sitting on my shelf, and I thought, that was really a thoughtful gift. I experienced that reality when, out of the blue, Linda reaches over and grabs my hand as we're taking a walk. And I feel that electricity slide up my arm, but more than that, I realize that it's not just the electricity, it's the steadfast. She has hung with me. She would tell you. She married me. She didn't know how crazy I was until we'd been married for a while, and she said, you were a lot crazier than you presented yourself before we were married. I think she used some other words. I don't think it was crazy. I think it might have been crack-headed, edgy, over the edge, whatever. You misrepresented yourself, James, but I love you anyway. Although the first year we didn't know if we'd make it, because the truth is, real me, pained me, unmerciful because I had never received mercy me came out. We survived that. And that steadfast love that I see in my wife reminds me of God's steadfast love. Where have you felt that love? I hope that, if my children ever see this sermon, one place that they would be able to touch at their various points in lives would be our love for them. That they felt, even at moments when they had messed up, and I know you find it hard to believe, but Hannah and Josh have both messed up once or twice in their lives, that they knew even in those messed up moments that we loved them. And that they knew that God loved them too. Do you have those moments? Because if you don't have those moments, you need to find somebody who can listen to you and help you sort through your life and figure out where those moments might have been. Because if you're going to live mercy, you have to experience mercy. And if you've experienced mercy, it needs to be concrete and real. It's not some kind of imagined thought up here. It's something that happened to you or happened because of you. That's what loving mercy is. That's what God's tenacious faithfulness is all about. Never giving up, never surrendering. Even when sometimes I would have given up on me somewhere around 13. And yet, at 52, God has yet to give up. And that's the God that we love and serve. Never gives up on you. Your love never fails, never gives up, never runs out on me. Did you hear that song we sang a little earlier? That's God's love. God's steadfast love never ends. So go and find those concrete touch points in your life, the moments that you need to remember when it all comes unglued, so that you can remember that God's love is with you, even in the really cruddy moments.